Janet, there's been a lot of talk in the church about mental health, mental illness, mental disorders. I'd like for us to start off with you just helping us think through some definitions that we can use.
Sure.
So talk to us a little bit about, in your understanding, what is mental health?
Right. When we think about mental health, we want to think about a person's overall well-being. And I think about that in a lot of different areas, right? I think about that biologically and psychologically. I think about that socially. And so in other words, when I look at someone, are they doing well in all aspects of their life, right? And all the different ways that they function in their life. And if so, then we would say that they have good mental health.
So then if we kind of move that to another way of asking that, what about mental disorders? Talk to us about what that means.
So when we talk about mental disorders, people will use a lot of different words for that. They might say mental disorder, they might say mental illness, they might say a psychological disorder or a psychological illness. So the language varies, but generally what we mean is that in some area of life, right, in one of these spheres of functioning, people are struggling, right? So they may have problems with their thoughts. They may have problems with their emotions, with their relationships, or with their behavior. And that then is interfering with their daily functioning, whatever their roles are, whether that's in the home with family or with coworkers, or just being able to perform at work or in school. And so we begin to see that those problems internally affect performance externally.
In the day-to-day life of the individual.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
So for everyone that might be watching this, help us, because we might say some of those phrases interchangeably. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Throughout here? So they might hear us say psychological disorder or mental disorder, but we're kind of saying the same thing.
Correct.
If they hear those words. Is that accurate? Okay.
Yes. Sometimes the word mental illness has a stigma to it. And so people will prefer the word psychological disorder or psychological illness because it sounds less bad in a way.
Okay. Well, talk to us about the stigma. Like, why is there a stigma around that? You say less bad, but what is that? Is that a shift in the way that we've talked? Because we used to say that a lot, it seems like, but maybe there is a transition away from that, or am I understanding that correctly?
I think there's always been some kind of stigma around mental health problems. Part of the reason is we don't understand them and we don't talk about them. I think particularly in the church, we don't talk about them. We tend to think that they are a sign that a person is lacking in faith somewhere. Sometimes some forms of mental illness have symptoms that are unusual. And so we don't quite know what to do with those. It may make us uncomfortable. Because we don't know how to engage in it, we think that it's odd or weird, right? And I think that's where the stigma comes from.
Yeah, definitely. So then let's just kind of talk of generally speaking. We're going to get into some detail over the series of these videos, but how common are mental disorders?
Well, that varies by disorder, but we know in general, over the course of our lifetime, that about 1 out of 2 of us will have a diagnosable mental disorder. Okay? Now, in any given year, that rate is going to be much lower. It also varies by disorder. So right now, here in the United States, anxiety disorders are the most common. And we're going to see that probably in about 1 out of 3 people over their lifespan. And so the anxiety disorders will include things like generalized anxiety disorder, where a person struggles with worrying all the time, or panic disorder, where they have panic attacks, or obsessive compulsive disorder. And so they'll have those kinds of things will all count as an anxiety disorder. The second most common category, if you will, of disorders are the depressive disorders. And those major depression would fit there. Some of the lower grade forms of depression would fit there. Those are going to occur probably in about 1 out of 3 women over their life and 1 out of 5 men over their lifespan. probably around 20-25% of the general population.
So, Janet, I would say, based on what you're telling us, that it's pretty safe to assume that in any given congregation, on any Sunday morning, for example,
Mm-hmm.
there's a good percentage of people sitting in the pews, if you will, who are struggling with some kind of mental disorder. Is that a fair assumption?
It is. I want to be a little careful how we say that, because when I talk about 1 out of 2 people at some point having a diagnosable mental illness, that's over the course of their lifetime.
Okay.
That's not at any given moment. Probably a safer estimate would say on any given Sunday morning in your congregation, about 10% of people. So 1 out of 10 people probably are struggling with something pretty significant.
Yeah, that's a good clarification. That really is helpful to have that. So let's talk a little bit about what causes mental disorders. Can you talk to us? I know we're talking about a lot of different categories, but generally speaking, how do you answer that question?
Right. My first answer is always it depends. My second answer is it's generally never simple. Causation seems to be due to a lot of different factors, and it does vary by diagnosis, and it varies by individual. Typically, though, the way that I like to think about it is to think about our created nature, right? And if we look at the human being, we can see that we are made in the image of God. And I would talk about us having 3 systems, if you will, that are all at play. We have a biological self, which is our physical body. We have a psychological self, which is really our thoughts and our memory and dreams and those sorts of things. And then we have a social self, which is the way that we do relationships. And I would include emotions in that. And we'll maybe talk about why a little bit later. And if we look at those 3 systems, they're separate, but they function as one, right? And then that whole system is in a spiritual relationship with God. So if I understand that that's our created nature, then I can begin to think about causation as in what areas of life will we see factors that predispose someone to mental illness. So biologically, we could talk about genetics, and some of the disorders have a really strong genetic diathesis, some of them don't. We can talk about neurotransmitters and body chemistry. We can talk about traumatic brain injury. So there are lots of things we can talk about biologically that may cause a mental disorder. Then psychologically, we could talk about the way that we think about the world, generally the way we think about ourselves, other people, and the future. And we know that if people have negative thoughts in all 3 areas, they're highly predisposed to depression. And we get a lot of those thoughts from our parents growing up. How do we interpret the world around us? And then emotions and relationships would be that social area. So what are our experiences with people? Do we have good, stable relationships with our primary caregivers? Have we experienced trauma or abuse over the course of our life? How balanced are our emotions, because those affect those relationships? And so if I look at any given person, I'm going to see a collection of these things that add up together with life experience that then leads to a mental disorder. So we will call that model the biopsychosocial model. And then when we understand what leads to the development of a mental disorder, we talk about something called a diathesis stress model. The diatheses are the predispositions, those factors I just talked through. And we know that the more diatheses that people have, the less amount of stress that they need in their life in order to manifest a disorder, right? But some people, no matter what stress they experience, will never develop a mental disorder for factors that I don't know that we quite understand, but there's some inherent resiliency in them. And then other disorders, if you have the diathesis, you absolutely will have the disorder. So if we think about something like Down syndrome, if you have that chromosomal problem, you will manifest the disorder.
You know, that really is helpful. And it makes me think about in the church, when we think about mental disorders and we think about people who might be struggling,
Right.
just giving a category and putting them in a category is probably not helpful. Because really what we need to do is we need to get to know them and their story.
Absolutely.
Because they have a story that comes with that. And that becomes really critical, especially as we're thinking about this all in the context for our purposes here about discipleship.
Right.
It's easy to just put someone in a category. It's a whole other thing to get to know them and their story,
Yes.
to begin to consider those different elements that might cause where
Right.
they are experiencing struggle at this moment.
And typically it's not, the solution is not going to be you need to pray more, or you need to read scripture more, or you need to trust God more. Typically, if I see a Christian with a mental disorder, they've already tried those things, right? I mean, they've prayed and they've prayed and they've cried out to God, and they're still struggling. Why are they struggling? Because they have so many pieces that are playing a part in this.
Yeah, and of course, you're not saying reading scripture and prayer aren't significant parts
Right.
of a spiritual formation for us.
Right. And they will be part of that person moving toward healing and wholeness.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think in the context of a more comprehensive approach to helping them.
Yeah. Trying to be more holistic. You consider all those elements that you described and what does integration of all of that inside of a person
Right.
look like in healing.
Mm-hmm.
That's really good.